Because that's gonna A, sweeten the soil, and B, it might help.
Yeah, sit on this side of the room,
Yeah.
it's not on camera.
And allow to reach out.
I haven't been there yet myself.
So,
My boss was telling me.
okay, so I gave him the right advice.
Yeah, just like you see, you know, so.
Well, gypsum allows the calcium
So
to.
gypsum is a form of calcium salt.
My older daughter's best friend.
So,
Okay, right.
so you have.
And she's the closest with it.
So
introduce yourself, Scott.
Yeah, I'm Scott Galloway with the Texas Water Development Board. I'm in the Houston office of the Water Development Board, and this is my first time. Been to the district before several times, it's my first time here at the networks.
Thanks for coming. He's the swift money guy. So be real nice to you. And Eve?
Hi, I'm Sharon Satino. I'm with the city of Houston. I joined the legal department back in November. I'm new to the state, so I'm excited to learn.
I'm Sarah Cardinal. I work with Veronica for the city of Houston in the infrastructure planning branch.
I think everybody else. Anyway, make sure you sign in for me. You know the subject, we talked about that. I get asked a lot of times when I start talking about or having people talk about endangered clams, zebra mussels and stuff, what they got to do with conservation. And whether it's wetlands or any of those things, I just feel like the effect on, if it has an effect on the quality and the quantity of water in any aspect around us, that it's all related. You know, the worse this bay gets off, the more it needs fresh water from other sources, the more they want to dig it out of the rivers, the more the rivers don't want to do it. The harder it is to get out of the rivers, the more we go back to groundwater. So it's all related to me, and that's why I wanted to have Erin come. But I want to read this because just in case. She again works for HARC, just down the road in the Woodlands, Advanced Research Center. Wetland and coastal ecologist whose research examines changes in habitat and water quality due to the impacts of expanding human development and land use change. Research, you know, I think that's the real important part for us down here. Research interests include wetland restoration, impacts of land use, and eutrophication on coastal systems, carbon and nitrogen cycling in wetlands. She graduated with a PhD in biology from the Boston University Marine Program and a BA in environmental and evolutionary biology from Dartmouth College. I think that's the first one. And she almost made it without going to A&M, but she didn't. She previously worked as a postdoctorate research associate in the Department of Marine Biology at Texas A&M University of Galveston and at the Ecosystem Center at the Marine Biological Laboratory in Woods Hole, Massachusetts. So the A&M site too were on the Pelican Island.
Yes.
So I was telling her I was born and raised down there. Wholesome life, had a wholesome life. Galveston. Fishing and going to church and stuff. So,
Stuff.
Thanks a lot. And then you're ready to go. She has a video at. Okay. So go ahead, and if they may interrupt you for questions, if there's a little stumbling on.
Which I'll start an interruption by just saying it's live streaming.
Yeah,
Don't get nervous, you know. But if you want to share, it's on our Twitter account.
Oh boy. All right.
We had one request, so there's one person.
Well, good. I'm glad. Welcome, whoever you are.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. My name is Erin Kinney. I am a research scientist at HARC, and that is the Houston Advanced Research Center. And we are a nonprofit research hub located in the Woodlands. And our scientists focus on air, water, and energy issues. And all of our research is really aimed at sustainability. So that is the common undercurrent undergoing all of the research that we do. We were founded by George Mitchell. We've been around for many, many years, and recently we have been kind of solidifying our mission and working more collaboratively. We are a major collaborator with a lot of organizations around Houston region especially, but also Texas and nationally, and even some international work. So I've been there for about 2 years. I absolutely love it, and I'm very happy to talk more about it if you all are interested. I also have a sign up for our newsletter, our e-newsletter, if anyone's interested, right next to the sign-in sheet. So today I'm going to be talking about a project that we worked on with the Texas AgriLife Extension, looking at wetland permits and wetland loss in the Houston-Galveston region. And the reason that I'm interested in wetlands is largely for the kind of ecosystems values that they provide. The biological population values, the populations that depend on the habitat, waterfowl, fish, shellfish, even timber, and threatened and endangered species, but also the ecosystems values. And these are the things like flood mitigation, fishery support, storm surge protection along the coast, aquifer recharge, and water quality improvement. And I've also, in my past life back on Cape Cod, done some work at the regional and global scale. So nitrogen cycling, carbon cycling, a lot of the chemistry and biogeochemistry of wetlands. But the thing about wetlands that I've always found so fascinating as a scientist is that they really are multiple value systems. And so those values change depending on what stakeholder you're speaking to. So stakeholders see wetlands differently, and it makes it, I think, more enjoyable and easier to talk about, because usually once you start explaining to people what wetlands are, because let's face it, a lot of people don't know what they are or where they are, they recognize them and they see something in there that they enjoy. So in Texas, wetland regulation is really largely at the federal level. And the first President Bush was the first one to bring about the no net loss policy. And this was the idea of wetlands were disappearing nationally. And there was a much more concerted effort to try and stem that loss and start replacing wetlands if they were going to be damaged or displaced by development or other activities. Most wetlands, not all, are regulated under the Clean Water Act. So that's 404. And those permits pertain to wetlands are the ones that are connected to waters of the United States. And a lot of the freshwater wetlands in Texas and in this region fall outside of that jurisdiction. And so that's something that I'll mention in a little bit. There have been a couple of Supreme Court cases that have argued about which side different wetlands should fall, jurisdictional or not. And right now, wetlands as a whole are under the Army Corps of Engineers and EPA joint guidance. There's some federal consistency review. The Clean Water Act, Section 401, that's implemented by TCEQ, Coastal Zone Management Act, that's implemented by GLO, as well as others. But also, it's important to remember that a lot of these wetland permits are up for public comment. In fact, I think almost every single one has to be open for public comment for some period of time or another. And that's really the time when nonprofits and citizens can get involved and find out what's going on and make their concerns known and really start taking more of an interest in these wetlands. Because at the local level, there are land development codes and subdivision plats and site plans for the different 8 counties and 118 municipalities in our study area, but they're all different. And consistency across the different counties even. So that's one of the things that we're hoping to address with the work that we're doing. So the population growth in our area is really, I think, the #1 threat to wetlands here. And really where we're expecting to see the greatest growth are these outer counties, which isn't that surprising. I mean, we're up here, we see freshwater wetlands, and every day we have less and less. And this is actually a map of the regional wetland loss. So a study by White et al. In 1993 looked at change between 1953 and 1989, and he estimated that we lost about 32,000 acres of wetlands in our region. That's about a 30-year period. In this 15-year period between 96 and 2010, we lost even more. So wetland loss is accelerating. And this heat map represents the loss between 96 and 2010. So these red spots are really high density wetland loss. Yellow is lower and white is the lowest of all. The thing that's misleading here is what's white is Houston, because most of that loss was prior to 96. So unfortunately, we don't have data from this first study to really make this a much more complete map. We really see a lot more red and a lot more yellow. But those losses are reflected across the counties, and I'll show you here as an example from Montgomery. that same period of time, 96 to 2010, we estimate this gain isn't real. It's 1, it's within the margin of error, but these are very real. So cluster and emergent wetlands, there's a little bit of a gain. And then shrub, so that was a slight gain. And really what that means is that the wetlands are disappearing, but also they're changing. So the vegetation is changing. And so you really are losing that habitat. Something else might be able to come in, but the birds that rely on those very tall trees, they have nowhere to go now. So that's why some of those loss numbers can be a little bit misleading. We might actually be losing more habitat than we. Different natural areas provide. So as far as water quantity goes, wetlands serve a vital purpose for groundwater recharge and also for slowing surface runoff and making it more manageable as it moves across the landscape. For water quality, the one thing about wetlands and these vegetation at varying heights is the way that it slows down that water and it allows debris to settle out. So not just the large debris that could, clog a culvert or something else down the line, but the small, fine particle suspended sediment that is a problem when you're talking about reservoirs, when you're talking about water clarity, when you're trying to look at water quality downstream. A study by Forbes that specifically looked at freshwater wetlands here in Texas found that there was quite a bit of nitrogen and phosphorus retention in those pericoppal wetlands. And so we're really hoping to show, they also showed the connection between those wetlands and other wetlands downstream, trying to demonstrate that they are connected to those more jurisdictional wetlands. And then finally, freshwater wetlands retain bacteria, but a lot of that is tied to residence time. So the water needs a lot of time in those wetlands for the bacteria to settle out and to improve that water quality. Do you have questions?
Definition of wetland?
A wetland can be defined usually by its soils. So they are saturated soils with vegetation that is specifically adapted to survive in water for prolonged periods of time. Wetlands don't necessarily have to have water all the time. They can be episodic, and so they look dry on the surface, but really the ground is still saturated underneath. And then when a big rain comes, they become this big pond, and everyone wonders, who's managing that field over there? It looks awful, but really it's doing us all a great service. Sorry about that. Excuse me?
Like Lake Shelter.
Yes. Like a lot of things, like the field that was across from my old apartment building. I mean, it was a great wetland. You could see the birds show up immediately. And so you knew they were eating something. So you knew that there was a vibrant ecosystem there, even if it didn't look like it most of the time. And one of the biggest ecosystem services in our region of wetlands is flood control. So wetlands are actually the most important built environment indicator of flood damage in our region. They reduce property loss from floods even more so than dams. As I mentioned earlier, the Clean Water Act is meant to regulate the discharge of dredge or filled material into water, including adjacent wetlands of the US. And anyone who is going to dredge or fill material into jurisdictional wetlands must obtain who's looking at, the number of permits in Galveston less than doubled, but the property damage was multiplied by 20 times. And that's even more extreme in Brazoria County with the same rainfall and amounts. And actually, if you look at Harris County, this is half the event rainfall-wise and twice as much property damage. And these are just from 2000. I don't know what these numbers would look like today. So I'm hoping either we can update that or he will, because this is a very striking example of the services that wetlands provide to our region. So as a result of those studies that had come before us, we really wanted to try and dig into these wetland permits and learn more about what they meant, what they were doing to wetlands in our area, where the wetlands were going. Because with no net loss, the idea is that if a wetland is negatively impacted, if it's destroyed or damaged, then the permittee has to restore that wetland or another wetland, or create a wetland somewhere so that it evens out. So we started by looking at the Army Corps of Engineers ORM 2 permit database. And if you want to know anything about 404 permits, this is where you start. It's like a massive encyclopedic list of all of the permits that have gone on in our region. At least it's supposed to be. And when we mapped all those green. And so we were focusing on the time period between 1990 and 2012. We figured anything before that, and we'd be lucky to find a paper trail. Their accounts until 2008. So it was a lot of requesting documents and digging things out of file cabinets. But just looking at that ORM2 database, what we did see was there was an increase in the number of 404 wetland permits. And that remains pretty steady. There was a little drop during that mini recession that affected the rest of the country much more so than Texas. But we weren't finding a lot of evidence of documented mitigation. That was just missing from this set, and we really suspected that there was mitigation going on, it just wasn't showing up in that index. To realize that we really needed to do a full permit analysis. So we took that list from the ORM2 data set. We used some other lists that other people had given us. There are a number of groups down in the Houston-Galveston or not, they think that this would be appropriate for conservation reasons or for water planning or what have you. So we had a slightly more inclusive list than what the Corps had originally given us. And we focused on those standard permits and nationwide permits because those were the ones that most often were mitigated. So some wetland was restored or replaced or built elsewhere to make up for what had been damaged. And then because that's how the Corps is required to manage their data. So out of those 100, we received 95 full permits. There were some missing information, and there were some permits that couldn't be found. As I said, there were a lot of file cabinets, and we had to ask for a lot of documentation. We did end up with about 50-50 of standard permits and nationwide permits. And we tried to get 50% of those with some sort of mitigation so that we had something to compare to. And our suspicions were confirmed. Much of the information that was in that ORM2 database wasn't as accurate as what was in the full permit record. So you really need to get the whole permit, all hundreds and hundreds of pages of maps and documents and letters and everything to really see what's going on and what was supposed to happen and what did happen in that site. Oops. When we reviewed them, what we found is that of the 95, 42% were out of compliance. Something was missing. Either a document wasn't filed on time or it wasn't completed at all, not the right number of acres were purchased at a mitigation bank or were restored. Something was off about that permit and it was out of compliance. Half of the ones we requested did require.
Were the permits approved?
Excuse me?
Were the permits approved?
The permits were approved, but then they weren't completed properly.
Okay.
Yeah. So 50% required mitigation. So we did get that target. We were able to look at mitigation versus non-mitigation permits. But of the ones that required mitigation, 58% were out of compliance. So obviously, and that's not too much of a surprise. If more is required, there are more ways it could be way later or go wrong. Out of the 95 permits we requested, only 7 had compliance inspections on file. So we were kind of surprised to see that until we did some more digging and learned what the compliance inspection requirements are for the Corps. And actually, in 2013, the Corps is only required to inspect 5% of its general permits. 10% of its individual permits, and 5% of those permits that require mitigation. And between 2008, 2012, they were actually exceeding their requirements. So they're doing a better job than the federal government would require. But there just isn't very much oversight on these permits. It's too big a job for them, and they're assuming that the permittee is going to do everything that they need to do. When we broke it down by nationwide and standard permits, we found a similar pattern to what we'd seen earlier. For the nationwide permits, 60% were in compliance. But once we looked at the mitigated only, that fell to 41%. And with standard permits, it was 53, and then mitigated standard permits were only 40% compliant. So, you know, hovering around half, certainly more than what's required to be inspected, but that's half the permits that weren't possibly seeing the number of wetlands restored as we're supposed to be. So what is mitigation? So mitigation could be just avoiding a wetland. It could be, you know, you have a site where you want to build a building, you are told there's some wetlands in the corner, you get that verified, and you just don't build over there. You leave them alone, you make sure the drainage isn't damaged, and that's one form of mitigation. The other form of mitigation is compensatory mitigation. So you're making up for wetlands that have been impacted negatively. And there are three types of compensatory mitigation. Permittee responsible, so the individual or the corporation or the organization that has the permit is responsible for creating or restoring those wetlands. In lieu fee, which is less common, and the Spring Creek Greenways mitigation in lieu fee bank was one example of that. It requires a lot of work and a lot of coordination to get the acres lined up and the money lined up and the construction projects lined up all at the right time. So in lieu fees are great, but they're a little more complicated. And then finally, mitigation banks. And these can either be privately or publicly run. And these are areas that have wetlands that they have either created or restored. And then they sell credits to people who are required to do mitigation on their property. So I'm not going to be able to build a wetland on my property. There isn't room, or I don't have the capacity to do it. I'm going to pay this mitigation bank, and they're going to restore an area on their property, and I'm going to pay them money to do that. The permits we looked at, about 40 were permittee responsible. That was by far the most common in those older permits. But and 11 had either in lieu fees or mitigation banks. But we're really expecting to see a shift from the permittee responsible to more mitigation bank compensation. And that is a trend that we've seen ourselves. It's also a trend that the Army Corps of Engineers is confirming. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that it is so difficult for them to get to all of these individual permit locations and inspect these sites and maintain their compliance when they can just go to a mitigation bank and inspect one site and essentially take care of it all in one swoop. Also, mitigation banks have a lot more regulations in terms of they have to make sure that those wetlands stay functional. There are a lot of permits in order to get them going there, and there's a little bit more oversight in those cases, yes.
How far does the mitigation bank have to be in relationship to the actual location of the wetland now?
So the mitigation bank is supposed to be in the same watershed as the impact that they're trying to compensate for. Now, watershed is a very loose term. Mm-hmm. Every little stream has a watershed that's proportional to its size. But then that little stream's watershed is part of the larger watershed for the larger creek or river that it flows into, the even larger river that it flows into, and eventually, you know, all of Galveston Bay. So that definition of watershed is something that we've taken a bit of issue with as scientists, because their version of watershed is not what we would like it to be. And I'll be mentioning that in just a minute. So when the study was done about a year ago, we had 10 mitigation banks, and we now have 24 in our region. And just, there are 24, yes, but a number of those are full, a number of those are private. They're specifically for DOT or for other groups that require that, and it makes the paper trail a little bit easier. They know that that land is waiting for them when they need to do something like build 99. But when we had just those 10, only 3 of the 10 mitigation bank permits that we examined use mitigation banks in the same Huck 8 watershed, which is not that small a watershed. That's a USGS designation of the size of a watershed. Only 3 of them were in the same Huck 8 as the impacted site. All those were Greens Bayou, which is private, which is right in the center of Houston. I'll show you that in just a second. So here's a map, the most recent map of all of the mitigation banks, these circles here, in our region. And these huge areas here are the service areas. So a lot of these are overlapping, and a lot of that's because some of these are private. So you need to have overlapping service areas. As one fills up, you need to have more options. But for instance, you could have an impact on a wetland up here near Tyler, and that mitigation bank for this service area is down here at Piney Woods. So those ecosystem services that were serving this community of Tyler have essentially been exported to Piney Woods. So, you know, what are we losing in terms of water quality, water quantity, flood control?
So if we keep it up, one day we can all go visit a wetland somewhere?
Yeah, theoretically, but they're private.
Yeah, they get a charge, but I mean.
Yes, you can visit the Spring Creek Greenways Trail. That was the in lieu fee.
Right.
And that is open to the public. And that is, I think, one of the most enjoyable wetlands in our area because you can see it by bike and, you know, mosquitoes aren't as bad and all that.
But then that go farther, it goes from where to where?
That goes, it stops right now at about Riley Fuzzle, which is right around where the Hardy Toll Road stops. And it goes about, I think, 13 miles south. I think it's 26 miles round trip.
Right.
And they're going to expand that up through the woodlands is
All
the
the way to
plan.
the woodlands. Actually, theoretically, you could walk from the woodlands to the San Jacinto River.
That's what they're hoping, yeah. So there are more efforts to create more mitigation banks, and the majority of the people who are doing this are doing it because they want to see these wetlands preserved. So Katy Prairie is a big area where they're trying to use this system to conserve some rare and endangered wetland habitats. But it's a slippery slope when you're trying to preserve a wetland here, or when you're just allowing all of these to disappear because you're essentially going somewhere else. So the way that compensatory mitigation works is you're actually supposed to create more wetlands than you destroy. And on paper, that actually worked out pretty well. So when we looked at the permanent impacts, the number of acres for those permits, there was, in the permittee responsible mitigation, 257 acres were permanently impacted. We don't know how many were temporarily impacted, and we don't know how long the temporary impacts lasted. Unfortunately, we just don't have that information in the permit record. But 887 were supposedly mitigated in response to that. We also don't know 10 years later if those wetlands are still there. That's something that we're hoping to look into in the future. For the mitigation bank credits, it's a little bit harder to follow. And that's because you have these permanent impacts, and those are replaced, used to be a 1-to-1 for acres, but now they're using a credit system. So they realized pretty early on that replacing a really pristine, healthy wetland with a piece of wet ground where you planted some wetland vegetation and crossed your fingers and hoped that it was going to work wasn't really the same thing. It wasn't the same for ecosystem services. It wasn't the same for habitat. So they're equating value now to different wetlands. So if a poor quality wetland alongside of a major highway is destroyed when they, widen the feeder road, they then buy the appropriate credits at a mitigation bank that are going to be better quality than those wetlands that were taken out. And so that's why this credit is here, 24 credits. And mathematically, it doesn't make any sense to any of us. There's a whole algorithm to figure out what this means. But it also means that tracking the no net loss idea is going to get harder and harder. So by looking at all these permits, really what we learned is that it's hard to get at this information. That ORM2 data set just doesn't tell us enough about no net loss. The federal permit inspection targets are being met, but compliance overall was pretty low. And the question of whether or not these mitigation acres are staying within the same watershed is something that really worries me as a wetland ecologist, and I think is something that we're interested in studying some more. So another thing that came out of this project is we realized that the development decisions of the counties and municipalities in our study area are in many ways disconnected from the federal process. So our next step was to go out and figure out what the local governments were requiring for wetland restoration or wetland even awareness on their permit websites. And what we found is that for all of these counties in our study area, every single one mentions the 100-year floodplain or flood mitigation somewhere on their permit website or their municipal website. They all mention septic systems, which is great. Both of those things should absolutely be mentioned by every single one. Only 4 even mention the word wetland or a 404 permit. So it's just, there just isn't a lot of awareness. If you want to know what permits you need to build your building, nothing's going to pop up and tell you, hey, you should be reaching out to the Army Corps of Engineers. For other things like the alteration of natural waterways, the state coastal management plan, stormwater management, which is no joke, as we've all seen, low impact development and parks and open space, these are much more rare. And so these things were falling through the cracks, we feared. We weren't really sure, it was hard to find out.
When you say these are the permitting agencies?
These are the counties themselves, and they have their permit office.
Not a city within the county, but just
No.
the county themselves.
This is the county itself. So yeah, Harris County does a great job with a lot of this stuff. But when you get to smaller municipalities, they don't have the staff, they don't have the resources to deal with a lot of these questions. And so that led us to kind of the second end product of this project. We put together a development permit wetland information tool. So this is a free online GIS-based tool that brings together as much information as we could to try and help some of these smaller municipalities navigate this issue and become more aware of this issue. So we brought together watershed information, impervious surface area calculations. Impervious surface area is how much of that area is paved, and this can have a major impact not only on water quantity, because pavement doesn't allow the water to percolate through and recharge aquifers, but also water quality, because it doesn't provide a trap for bacteria or other things that we don't want in our waterways. We also listed 303D impacted streams. So these are streams that already have environmental issues of one kind or another. Wetland types. There are 2 different nationwide maps of wetlands in different areas. There's the NWI, and then there's the CCAP, and we show both of them. So if you want to know how likely it is that there's a wetland there, we will tell you there's probably a wetland there. Go check it out. We also include the 100-year floodplain, and if anyone's interested, the mitigation bank service areas. So if you were to develop that piece of property, what mitigation banks might be an option for you? And we even included the existing Army Corps of Engineers permits and the permit number. So if you wanted to develop on a piece of property, or if as a town you were concerned about development on a piece of property, you could see if other permits nearby and what issues those permits had or didn't have at that time. And it would be a lot easier to do a FOIA request for just that number than to have to go through the whole process we did to try and figure out where that is. And so this is going to be available on the HARC website. It's called the Wetland Tool. And I'll showing you some of these in just a minute. You can zoom in, you can scroll around, and then this is the list of Army Corps of Engineers permits, impaired streams, 100-year flood plan, counties, watershed imperviousness, wetlands from NWI and from CCAP, and mitigation banks. So here are all of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineer permits in that region. You can zoom in, you can figure out how many are in your neighborhood, how many are around your building, your school, that piece of property that you think you might want to buy as an organization. You can look and see what's there. You can also zoom in on a very specific area, and this is showing the 100-year floodplain of an area on the coast of Galveston Bay, and it's overlaid with the various permits that exist and have been filed in this region. Oops. Then this is the impervious surface area. So this is listed at 20% impervious surfaces. So below 10% impervious, below 10% paved is considered to be minimally impacted. 10% to 30% is impacted, and greater than 30%. Now that doesn't sound like much, but it makes a big difference for water quality. So that's something that we want some of these smaller municipalities to be aware of. If they're on the cusp of 30%, they're probably going to want to think more about conserving some of that non-impervious, some of that open space, some of that places where groundwater can infiltrate the ground, or surface water can infiltrate the ground. So these green and orange and purple areas, these are different kinds of wetlands that show up in that wetland layer. And this layer actually shows different areas that are most likely wetlands, because this is based on reflectance of satellite data, than this data layer, which is based on people going out and verifying, yes, there was a wetland here, but this data is a lot older. So some of this data goes back to the 90s, and we don't know if that wetland's still there or not. That's why we provided both. But if you're looking at developing this piece of property, it's still worth a look to see if there are wetlands there. And that's just what you can do. So this tool actually enables you to draw a boundary or to even upload a shapefile if you're interested in a specific piece of property. And once you've done that, drawn this boundary, and you can adjust it so that it really fits the area that you're interested in, you can see that there was a wetland permit right there. If you click on that dot, it will tell you your permit number, and you can then request that information from the Corps if you'd like. There's one right over here that was associated with that. And once you hit enter, or run, I should say, on this tool, it's going to deliver some general information about this piece of property. How many acres? What county are you in? So where are you even going to go to find out more about getting a permit? Are there any permits in that area? This is the standard permit. It then tells all the potential impacts to developing on this piece of property located there. It says palustrine forested wetlands, so freshwater forested wetlands. That's confirmed by the NWI. Is it in the 100-year floodplain? Yes. So chances are that's going to trigger something in the permitting process as well. What watershed is impacted? This is the Clear Creek Frontal Galveston Bay sub-watershed. It's 22% impervious. So that's already kind of in that danger zone for if you're a developer or really more of a town manager, you might want to be aware of that. And there is a 303D impaired stream nearby, and that's the stream number. And if you click on that, it will take you more information about why that stream is impaired and what's going on there. And then if you're interested in it, these are the mitigation bank service areas that overlap with this area. So we're trying to provide more information to the planners, to the city officials, to let them know if somebody wants to build here, they can pull this up. You know, they don't have to rely on the permittee to do it and figure out what's going on. And they don't have to buy a GIS license to do it. And that was something big when we went and talked to a lot of these smaller municipalities. They don't necessarily have the money to buy GIS. They might have a staff member who's used it in the past, or they might share a staff member with another department, but they don't necessarily have the money for the big GIS suite. So the conclusion of this study was that no net loss really does mean no net loss of jurisdictional wetlands. And that's something that we're going to have to deal with as a region going forward, because we're losing more and more of these freshwater wetlands, and really no one's keeping track right now. In terms of wetland permits, there are some transparency issues. It's very difficult to get all of that information from the Corps. It takes time, it takes money. You have to pay for those Freedom of Information Act requests. It takes time on the part of the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. So we're trying to make that more efficient and put everything in one place for people just what they need to know, so it takes them a little bit less time. The success of mitigation is unclear. It's a difficult battle, and I appreciate how hard the Corps works. The people who are there really are trying to protect these resources and all responsible for, but they're understaffed, and it's a challenge. So I think really we need more people on deck for this kind of issue. Just leaving it to the Corps is really a challenge. And that disconnect between the local permitting decisions and what's going on at the federal level, I think is one of the ways we can address that. So our next steps, this is a project that just got going at the end of last year. We are going to start by comparing the Corps mitigation requirements to habitat restoration metrics from the literature. We really want to know when something is restored, what does that mean? What does it look like? How functional is this wetland? And how long does it have to remain functional? Is it 5 years? Is it 10 years? What happens after 15? So we want to look more into that. Things have been a little more automated. We're hoping things have improved. And then we're going to be reaching out to local governments and planners and developers, as well as citizens groups, to try and enhance this mapping tool and make it easier to use and make it something that really can help with this process. So this was one, and as I mentioned, it has just gotten going for the second year through GLO. But we also have a number of other projects that talk about wetlands and focus on wetland loss and what we can do to help prevent that. And the first is the Galveston Bay Report Card. And this is a specifically public-focused outreach effort to bring all of that information about what people think of as the health of Galveston Bay into a location. So on galbaygrade.org, there's information about water quality, freshwater inflows, sea level rise, fisheries data. If someone wants to know if it's safe to swim at their local beach or fish in their local stream, Galveston Bay Report Card website. We did provide wetland loss grades, and we separated out for saltwater and freshwater wetlands. So freshwater wetlands received a D grade, which means requires action. That's how we, there's a lot more about the grading in the Galveston Bay Report Card. And saltwater wetlands actually got a C, so adequate for now. And that's because there's been a lot of restoration effort in saltwater wetlands around Galveston Bay, and it's been highly successful. So that is actually something that we seem to be doing right. And the more we do that, the better off we'll be when it comes to saltwater wetlands. But we'd really like to see some of that attention paid to freshwater wetlands as well. Another project that we have is the wetland-friendly drilling application. And this was a project that was looking at best management practices for oil and gas exploration in and around wetlands. And what we found pretty quickly is that Texas doesn't have any. They're all federal. So what we did is we brought together all of these different, we're calling them wetland impact measures. So anything you can do as an oil and gas operator to minimize your footprint in a wetland is now listed in one place. It's searchable. There's a GIS component to it, and there's a teaching component to it. We will tell you which phase of this BMP or WIM for. We'll tell you what ecosystem services will benefit by using that one. And that's all, again, free and available at the WFD app.
I was kind of surprised to find that one could do oil and gas exploration in a one of the, they are the University of Texas Board of the big guy. He actually, his family has a wetlands area on the Trinity River, I think.
I think I've heard of that, yes.
And he was having them drill there, so I know there was some concern about maybe we ought to be real careful.
It can be relatively low impact. One of the issues that is also tangentially related to wetlands is the amount of water that's required for these oil and gas operations. So I'm actually next week going to a conference that's talking about water and energy exploration and how those things are interconnected and what we can do for that, yes.
On the drilling applications, have you received good support from the Oil and gas interests?
Group. And that is a consortium that has a number of partners in big oil companies, research institutions, a couple of other nonprofits, but also universities. And it's basically bringing all these people together to try and develop more environmentally friendly technologies for oil and gas exploration. And so a lot of those people are saying, yes, this is exactly the kind of thing we do at Shell or BP or Chevron, but the little guys don't have access to that information. So we're hoping that by bringing it together in one place, because something similar exists for Colorado, but they wouldn't necessarily know to look at the University of Colorado's law school for information on how to conserve wetlands. So that's why we brought it here.
We hate to see the same thing happen here as happened in Louisiana.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, it's been really dramatic in Louisiana, especially those coastal wetlands. And our final product, this is one that we're still developing, is the Texas Gulf Coast Wetlands Story Map. And this is something I can actually show you now. Or maybe it would be better if I answered some questions about the presentation first, and then I'll take you through this. This is also at hercresearch.org, and this brings together all of those GIS maps and some of these applicants illustrating wetland functions, and provides it in a very user-friendly format so that you can just scroll through and kind of get the story of Texas wetlands. So I'm going to go back to the last bit I was talking about, the project on the wetland loss in our region. I'm happy to answer any questions, and then I guess I'll wrap up by showing you that tool. So thank you. Yes, I think your hand was up first.
I'm trying to think of how to word this. So in an era of master plan communities and some of the developments, I mean, I was here when the Woodlands Mall went up, and that was awesome. A lot of loitering. But I'm just imagine that the way the water was flowing has changed, and what was a drier area is suddenly a wetland. And maybe that's not in anybody's records. Is that a problem as far as keeping the information up to date?
So that's a big issue, and I have a sneaking suspicion that's kind of what happened with the flooding on 99, because from what I understand, 99 was designed with a 500-year floodplain or flood maps in mind. So it would be an event that was as rare as once every 500 years that you would get flooding in this area. But I don't think that necessarily took into consideration just how much had been paved over in that floodplain prior to that big rain event that we just had. So when you do create impervious surfaces in a floodplain, they're not going to flood the way that nature intended them to, and drain the way that nature intended them to. So you are going to get wet streets in addition to areas that used to be dry are suddenly wet.
And if I own that property and have for 40 years, so I'm thinking of like the Woodlands, for instance, and I owned it and it wasn't a wetland, can somebody then come in and go, oh, well, it is now?
That's a little bit more difficult because you do own it. The thing is, if you, let's say you owned 10 acres and you've got your house on one small portion of that, you might have felt like that area was dry when you were a kid, but it was probably always wetland. And it probably did flood and you just weren't necessarily out there when it did. Once they paved all the properties around you, that's where the water ends up, because they've created all this nice sloping, driveways and streets that drain onto your property and add to it as well. So now your wetland looks a lot more like a wetland, and you can't necessarily develop it. But that's that issue of flooding and changing over time is a big issue downtown. So there are neighborhoods, a lot of those older neighborhoods that never used to flood now because there's no wetland left out in the larger watershed to absorb that water. So it's all basically flowing in and to Buffalo Bayou and overflowing its banks, and these people are standing in water going, but when I built here, it was dry. This never happened. And they're right, it never did. everything changed around them. It's very frustrating.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I actually have two questions for two different periods of time. The current time, as a manager of a utility district and being in Montgomery County, I review site development plans and issue permits for them to construct on these plans. County itself is not doing anything as far as regulating wetland permitting and so forth. Is that something that the lower level of government agencies should be looking at? Or are we required to do that? Or
I honestly don't know how that works in the utility districts, but I think it certainly can, because if you're, the way that development seems to progress around here is that you have a large scale developer coming in, and so they're going to be addressing the utility districts, they're going to be addressing the county regulations, any sort of township regulations. They're going to be going through all of those different groups before they're permitted to build what they want to build. I mean, down to mailboxes that have, that's all a negotiation. So when you've got a new area coming in, I think that is the time to step back and say, okay, well, here's this new tool I've got. Look at how many wetlands it says are here. What are you going to do about that? Are you going to do the minimum that's required by the Corps of Engineers, or are you going to go a little bit further? What about when they do even more impervious surface? It's going to flood, you know, make this into a park or a jogging trail or, you know, something that enhances the value of that development, as well as preserving the safety of the homeowners and the ecological diversity and ecosystem services that the wetlands provide. So I think they can all work together, and I think certainly from a water perspective and a groundwater perspective, it would be in your best interest to at least ask.
well, yeah, asking is easy to do, but
Yeah.
enforcement is another tool
Right.
that it's harder to do. And,
Right.
you know, people spend a lot of money on these properties, and especially in high developed areas that we're in. And so it's, you know, you start telling somebody, well, hey, you know, there's a half an acre on your property here. It's wetlands. You can't go until you go jump in the lake, because I paid $1 million for that half acre of land and I'm not going to waste it, you know?
Exactly.
But the other part of the question was.
Wait, before you finish,
Mhm.
Rick, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, but it's not, the federal government has a lot to say about that wetland.
They do if it's jurisdictional. But up here, that's not necessary. That's a little harder to
Maybe the wet.
prove. I mean, if you're within a 100-year floodplain, it's pretty easy to see that wetland is connected to that stream, and then it's probably
But I'm just saying,
jurisdictional.
if it's an obvious wetlands and people start building on top of it, the Corps has something to say.
They do.
And so it's not like it's up to you to stop this. There is supposed to be an agency that helps watch them too.
And all those maps were just updated too.
Yes, they will.
I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, the other part of my question was just kind of more of a comment type question. Back in my former years as a consultant, and I worked with developers on developing district back in the 80s, and they started coming out with these rules about determining wetlands at that time. And it just seemed like every Tom, Dick, and Harry came out there and said, oh yeah, you got a wetland here and you got a wetland here. And there was really nobody out there regulating it, you know, caused a lot of pain. Is there somebody out there now that actually has skills to be able to make determinations now on these wetlands if there's some new ones that crop up? And
So if you are certified as someone who can identify a wetland, that is, you're supposed to have gone through schooling and certification to say, yes, it's a wetland, or no, it's not. And so a lot of those consulting companies do that because there aren't enough people at the Corps who can come out and do it themselves. So if you were, you know, concerned that this area that had been, they could verify it either way for you. That's kind of what they do. But for the most part, you know, someone can go out there and say, well, that looks like a wetland plant to me. I think that's it. But they also should have some soil tests and and be looking at the surrounding
I
vegetation.
mean, you've got, there's palmetto, it's
Yeah.
not the case, you know.
No, you can buy palmetto in
Yeah.
nursery, yeah.
That's the idea when we plant palmettos.
Yeah.
But you know, the
Okay,
apply also to linear construction. I know the North Authority built around Cypress Wood area. There was a lot of times they had to go underground and bores for quite an area because somebody, I mean, legitimately, obviously, had to be proved. But even that, you had to go under those wetlands or somehow not disturb that property.
Well, and the newer sections of the woodlands even, they have built the roads up higher and conserved more of those flood. So like the newest areas of Creekwood and those areas were very, very dry in this last flood event because that was built in. And there are huge swaths of floodplain that were left completely undisturbed. The road is no one really noticed that there was much flooding there until they left their neighborhood and went to some of the lower lying areas that were closer to the creeks and stuff. So there have been some better choices made in some of these areas, but it's hard when you're making the best decision in 1977, not knowing if this woodlands idea is going to take off, and all of a sudden it's huge and you've got loads of asphalt and school parking lots and all sorts of stuff going on. And you have to cancel school because the parking lot's flooded. Yes.
In reference to that, I noticed that, there, a wooded area has a number of different kinds of ecosystems. And I think one of the things that's happened in the woodlands, and probably other areas too, is that they've taken the woods out and on the edge of the woods.
Yes.
And so you have a completely changed ecosystem there. Does that also apply to wetlands? Because if I'm looking at a wetland area here and one over here, that they somehow support each other with wildlife and particularly with birds.
They do. They probably support each other hydrologically, even if we can't see it. So that's something that drives me bananas. Right behind my house, I live in the woodlands, I live adjacent to it. They cut down a forested wetland right behind my house to put in a retention pond. That's grass. It's not going to provide the same all at work one summer day. My husband's teacher, so he was home, and he says, "You're not going to want to come home. They cut down all the trees." So it was a shock to us, and I'm anxious to see what they do with it. Earlier with bacteria retention is you really need this wetland to hold that water for a long time. It can't just look like a stream with wetland vegetation next to it. It's got to slow that water stories here in Houston, but it's tricky. It's science trying to recreate nature that takes hundreds of years to development. So I think we're still kind of learning as we go.
Harris County does a good job of trying to de-line all their storms. Can't do all of them, but they, the goal was to get it out as fast as good.
Right.
And now they're doing more about planting the sides of these ditches and trees.
whatever. But that's something that takes a lot of work and a lot of careful planning on their part. And I think that's why more and more nonprofits are getting involved in this and trying to take a look at these permits as they're coming through. Because they're trying to raise these issues like the floodplain issue before they get out of hand, and trying to, protect what they can. If they see a particularly fragile or unique wetland habitat that's under threat, you're not going to create a cedar swamp somewhere else. You're just going to
You
go.
would think that the wetland banks would be acutely concerned about compliance.
The banks are.
Maybe you want to watch these guys and
Yeah.
make sure that somebody came to them to get the right permit.
But at the same time, all they're doing is saying, okay, you want to buy this many credits from me? Okay, here are your credits.
Yeah.
That's where it stops.
So what's the penalty if someone, a developer,
It's monetary, but I'm not sure.
I just wonder, because I know it's happened, and I won't do 150 acres, 50 of it's wetland, and I'm just gonna try to get away with it.
Yeah, I actually don't know. That's something that we'd like to find out more about, but obviously that's not really a permit record.
That helps a little.
Or you can't build in this
Yeah.
county for the next 50 years.
Now, what you call
Yeah. Yes, another question?
I'm just playing with that thought process in my mind. If you're gonna build a building in this area or subdivision, that's purchase wetlands, then get the process and it goes here.
Mhm.
Why wouldn't that land be designated the same as this one? So if this one's purchased, this one should not be touched, definitely.
Well-
Unless somebody wants to purchase that and build another one.
Very often
So
what they're
why
doing
is there
is
no
they're
limits?
purchasing a created wetland. So this is area that maybe was a wetland historically, and it's dried up because there isn't enough water, and so it's lost a lot of its wetland vegetation. So they'll go in and they'll restore it. They'll pull out the willow and the ginseng and all the invasive species. They will restore the hydrology. They'll take out the plugs that are upstream, and they'll make this former wetland into a more thriving environment. And so that's what they do in these mitigation banks in many cases, is they're actually restoring a degraded or historical wetland, and so that they're creating it in a sense.
What would you say is the objective based on what you presented here for this particular water region? And forgetting the waters of the USA implications and all the federal stuff. It shouldn't be a federal issue.
I would think so. I think there's a major perception problem in Texas about how much water we have and how much water we're going to need. And I think that there are a lot of people who don't even realize how rare and precious the water that we're using right now is. A lot of the work that I've been trying to do has a public outreach component. So when we create these tools, we're trying to make them useful for scientists and managers, but also accessible to the general public. And the report card takes that to the extreme. That's strictly for the public. It's, the science is real and it's in there, but we're not going to show them, graphs and data tables. We want to show them pictures and infographics and easy to understand grades. So I think the more that the public can appreciate about these things that matter, there might be more pushback in terms of how things are developed in the future. So we've already started to see that now with master plan communities. When those came along back in the 60s and 70s, they were incorporating parks, they were incorporating green spaces. And then now when communities are being built, they're incorporating natural spaces. So they're preserving that little wetland area, mostly because someone told them they have to, but they're making it into a draw. They're putting a park next to it. They're putting a jogging trail around it. So the more of that I think that can happen, the more we can restore our riversides and our riparian zones and make those accessible so that people can appreciate them, as well as the fact that we're protecting them. I think that will really help push this issue more to the forefront. And if we can tie it to the other issues that are going on, or water quality or water quantity, I think that helps more and more people as well.
We've had 2 or 3 people speak about low impact development for trying hard to Because to me, the goal would be here in the county is it's still pretty empty and pristine, and just try to keep it. Or whatever, but it's astounding to see the texture of the coast. And to see the big red swath that was the wetlands just 100 years ago, and they're this big. It's just a huge change in that color, the same way with grasslands and everything else. But we're trying to, again, promote the fact that low impact development can help with the water issues, the retention of the water, the cleaning of the water, and slowing it up for flood purposes, and just quality. And we're still, thank God, our recharge areas are up in the forest, most of them. So they're not being built on, but that's another thing you have to start worrying about is people developing on the outcrops of our aquifers. That's the kind of stuff we got to prevent before it's too late.
Well, if y'all would like, I can, brief question for them.
Just kind of long term, I guess, is mitigation all just keep moving? So you don't think that at one point it just, you don't have any more space to save it, it just can't build, right?
Absolutely.
So can we just stop?
Going
saying,
tomorrow.
no, we can't do it at all, or is no mitigation?
I don't think we've reached that point yet. People in Texas seem to think that the land is as unlimited as everything else. Since I came from Massachusetts, where we couldn't even have our dump on Cape Cod anymore because we were out of space, we had to truck our garbage off Cape. It was shocking to me that people don't recycle because they think, what's the point? We got plenty of land. There is that issue in other parts of the country. There aren't any more wetlands to restore. You can't, if you cut down that tree, there's no place to plant another tree, kind of an idea. And right now we're fortunate that we still have plenty of land in Texas. But I don't see that being as powerful a motivator as money or, sorry, your people, if you build those houses, they can't have any water.
Want to show the video?
Sure. Okay, can you all hear me from here? Unfortunately, I don't think I can take this out of here. This is a story map. So this is a GIS Esri product. And we put this together in HARC with our GIS and IT teams. And the idea behind this is that you can take all this content or content that other people have created and put it into one place and kind of guide people through a discussion of whatever topic is of interest to you. So for us, that was Texas Gulf Coast wetlands. And we realized that the uniqueness of this ecosystem is rather underappreciated. Our wetlands don't look like Louisiana wetlands. They're not green, and as far as the eye can see, they're a little brown. Our water is brown. We have beautiful birds, incredible wildlife. So we really wanted to highlight these wetlands that we have here and show them off in a way that's also educational. So the idea behind this is that all the way on that right-hand side, that little house is your and you can just scroll through and see the story as it progresses. So by going down through it, of course I don't have a mouse, so it's fighting me. There we go. This takes us to different aspects of the Texas coastal zone and shows it kind of as we go. And of course, the internet's not working properly right now. Let me refresh that. All right. So here's a video of the app. And as I mentioned earlier, you've got your home page and all those different chapters there on the side. And then you can just scroll through, and it's going to take you to different functional pages. So this is like a tour of the different counties along the coast. And you've got your population numbers there, your acres of wetlands, your acres of developed land, and then a picture of either a wetland in that county or wildlife, just to give people an appreciation of what's going on all along the coast. We've got more general information, lots of pictures, trying to make this as engaging as possible. This goes into the wetland functions. So everything from sediment biogeochemistry, water filtration, flood control, and then there's more detailed information about these different ecosystem services that you would find in wetlands. We've also got a video that we pulled from somewhere else that's got more information about, specifically about Texas wetlands. This is our Texas Coastal Resources Bureau. We just finished building this. This is actual data from Fish and Wildlife and Texas Audubon and also TCEQ. So we've got, this is bird data for all of the major bays. You can actually select a species and it will tell you more information about that. You can graph it and see how that population has changed over time. So you can compare the different species. You can export it as a separated file to see in Excel. This is great for scientists who want this data, but it's in a very user-friendly pictorial format. For fish, you can look at the different gears. You can see the catches and catch per unit effort. Look at your various species, graph them against each other. Yes, you have a question?
Real quick,
Oh, yeah.
since you're in the fish part, just touching base on the amount of fish in Texas Parks and Wildlife they recommend that you eat coming out of the Galveston Bay. How long would that take to clean out?
I
4 ounce.
I'll address that in a bit. That's a big question, actually.
Oh, yeah, it is a big question.
This is some of the water quality information that we have through Clean Rivers and TCEQ as well. And you can even go down to the station ID. So if you know what the station ID is as a scientist and you want to know more about it, you can find all the data here. And it's a little bit more friendly than TCEQ's website. This is showing some of the impacts to wetlands. So this is, the wetlands are there in the pink, and then we have oil and gas wells and flood wells. And you can see there's quite a bit of overlap in this region. So we're just trying to get people used to the idea that there are a lot of reasons that I mentioned earlier that brings together all of that information about impact minimization measures. And it's a searchable database. You can thumb through the library if you'd like to see what some of them look like. Everything from replanting with native vegetation to avoiding wetlands at breeding times to restricting dogs on site. That's a major issue in a lot of wetlands, is just keeping dogs off site because dogs go after bird nests. So this is kind of where this ends. This tool goes, or this story map goes on and then discusses some of the drilling activities that have been going on around High Island. And so High Island, located down on Bolivar, right on the coast, is not only a very active salt dome for oil and gas drilling, it is also a hugely popular bird sanctuary and bird viewing location, and it is right next to the Anahuac National Wildlife Refuge and tons of wetlands. So everything in one place. You've got tourists, you've got oil and gas drillers, you've got birds, everything. So we've been working with USGS to look at the sediment in some of those areas to see if there's any legacy of that oil and gas drilling. Because nowadays, when a well is plugged, there's a whole procedure to do that. Back in the 50s and 60s, that procedure was stringently enforced. So hoping to show that this new method of plugging really makes a big difference, and maybe we should go back and check. And see a lot of projects. We're really trying to create products can be caught. And the ship channel is off limits, and for almost every species. And certain kinds of catfish are really not a good idea because they are in the sediments that may be contaminated. But for the most part, everything else is fine. So shellfish, any of your shrimp stuff, a lot of your, even your larger species are totally fine. And once you get out into the Gulf, those regulations, those warnings aren't even there. So that's one of the things we really worked hard to do with the report card, is to bring those together. The same thing with beach closures. With all these rains, thankfully it's not summer yet, but they're going to be closing, they probably already have, a lot of the beaches along Galveston Bay for bacteria counts. And that just comes with the territory, we've got all this runoff. So we've got that information there, as well as links to the Beach Watch data if you want to know what's happening today. This is meant to provide a snapshot grade for the data. So this latest snapshot was for 2014 data. So people kept asking us, how is the bay doing right now? I know it's a lot better than it was in the 70s, but how's it doing right now? So that's what we wanted to answer. And right now we're working on the 2015 data that'll be coming out in August, and we'll be updating this. And so as I mentioned earlier, it's everything from habitat, like how are the wetlands doing, to water quality, to impacted streams, and things like the fish and wildlife. So the bird populations in Galveston, for the most part, in Galveston Bay, are holding steady. That's great news. Fish species, we're doing pretty well, but remember 2014, we were coming off of a drought. So things like the blue crab were not doing so hot. Brown shrimp populations were declining a bit. We're hoping that when we look at the 2015 data, those will be bumping back up because of all this fresh water that we've had. So that's why we're doing it every year, to show people, yeah, it's an ebb and flow, just like everything else. But we want people to be informed as much as they can. So please do check it out. And also there's a survey on here. So if you think we're missing something, or you'd really like to know more about something that isn't in the report card, let us know, because we're coming out with new indicators every year.
Excuse me, I have to, at 3 o'clock, be on a conference call. I have to leave. If y'all can stay and visit as much as you like, James will introduce, he'll entertain you. And I said, feel free to continue. I don't want to interrupt, but I just need to go do that.
I'll put these over there if anybody wants to see them.
Thank you, sir.